April 29th, 1970. American troops were supposed to take a week to reach North Vietnamese sanctuaries 80 miles away, giving the enemy plenty of time to evacuate their supplies, scatter their forces, and disappear into the jungle like they'd done for 5 years straight. Instead, 10,000 soldiers appeared deep inside Cambodia before the NVA even realized they'd crossed the border, prompting one enemy commander to write 5 words that captured his complete shock. Good God, they're already there. But how did an entire division move 80 miles through hostile jungle in just 48 hours? And why did this tactical masterpiece that terrified the North Vietnamese ultimately change nothing about how the war ended? You clicked on a title that promised something impossible. American troops moving 80 miles in 48 hours through thick jungle. North Vietnamese commanders so shocked they could barely believe their own reports. Good God, they're already there. Those 5 words captured a moment when everything the enemy thought they knew turned out to be wrong, and you're about to discover exactly how it happened. By spring 1970, the war had settled into a frustrating pattern. Just across the border in Cambodia, 2 entire North Vietnamese divisions sat in total safety. The 5th NVA Division, the 7th NVA Division, roughly 40,000 enemy soldiers. They lived in massive camps with hospitals, training grounds, supply warehouses, and command bunkers. They would cross into South Vietnam, attack American bases, kill soldiers, then run back across the border. And every single time, American forces had to stop at that invisible line. Cambodia was off limits. President Nixon had promised the American people he would not widen the war. So the enemy sanctuaries became untouchable fortresses. American intelligence officers knew where everything was. They had maps showing Base Area 352, Base Area 353, Base Area 354. They knew where COSVN headquarters was located. COSVN stood for Central Office, for South Vietnam. It was the enemy's main command center for the entire war. Officers would stare at these maps every day, knowing exactly where the enemy lived, knowing exactly where the supplies were stored, but unable to do anything about it. It was like watching someone rob your house through a window you couldn't break. The jungle pressed down on everything. By midday, the temperature hit 120 degrees. The humidity made it feel like breathing underwater. Your uniform never dried. Sweat poured down your face and back constantly. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick you breathed them in. The sound of cicadas filled the air with a high-pitched drone that never stopped, making it hard to hear anything else. Every soldier carried an 80-pound rucksack. The straps cut into your shoulders after the first mile. By the end of a patrol, your shoulders were raw meat under the fabric. The smell hit you in waves, wet vegetation rotting in the heat, red clay mud that stuck to everything, diesel fuel from the generators that ran all night. And underneath it all, that sweet, sick smell of jungle decay that got into your nose and stayed there. But the real weight wasn't the heat or the bugs or the rucksack. It was knowing the enemy had all the advantages. They knew the terrain. They knew the trails. They knew exactly where to hit and exactly where to run. And they knew Americans would chase them to the border and stop. Every time. It had been 5 years of the same game. The North Vietnamese had grown comfortable. Intelligence reports showed enemy soldiers bathing in streams just 500 meters inside Cambodia. They lit cooking fires at night that you could see from across the border. Supply convoys moved in broad daylight on roads that should have been hidden. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. Why should they? The Americans couldn't touch them. Then something changed. April 29, 1970. 1,700 hours. That's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. President Nixon made a decision. He authorized Operation Rock Crusher, the Cambodian incursion. After 5 years of watching the enemy hide across the border, American forces finally got permission to go in after them. The sanctuaries were no longer off limits. Every fire base in South Vietnam erupted with activity. Finally, soldiers thought, finally we can finish this. But there was a huge problem. The North Vietnamese weren't stupid. They had spies everywhere. They watched American bases. They saw the buildup. Helicopters moving into forward positions. Fuel dumps being established. Artillery pieces being repositioned. Ammunition stockpiles growing. Tank columns forming up. All the signs of a major operation. The NVA had days of warning, maybe a full week, and they knew exactly what to do because they'd done it 100 times before. Scatter the troops, bury the supplies, blend into the local population, wait for the Americans to leave, then come back and start over. The real problem was distance and time. Base area? 353, the main NVA logistics hub, sat 80 miles from the nearest American position. 80 miles of jungle, rivers, and terrible roads. If American armor and infantry had to grind their way there in columns, they'd move maybe 2 or 3 miles per hour. That's if everything went perfectly. If the enemy didn't ambush them. If bridges didn't collapse. If rivers weren't too deep to cross. The math was simple and brutal. 80 miles at 3 miles per hour meant roughly 27 hours of movement. But you can't move 24 hours a day through hostile territory. You have to stop at night, set up defensive positions, rest the troops, check equipment. So, realistically, pushing 80 miles would take 5 to 7 days. A full week. The North Vietnamese High Command did the same math. Their intelligence officers wrote reports. Their generals held meetings. They calculated how long it would take for American columns to reach the sanctuaries. 5 days minimum, they concluded. Probably 7 days. Plenty of time to evacuate. Plenty of time to hide the important supplies. Plenty of time to move the prisoners and the documents. They'd done this dance before. They knew the steps. Up at NVA headquarters, officers relaxed. Some even joked about it. The Americans are coming, they said. In a week, we'll be gone. In 2 weeks, they'll leave. In 3 weeks, we'll be back. It was the same pattern that had worked since 1965. The Americans had helicopters, they had tanks, they had massive firepower. But they were slow, they were predictable, and they always stopped at the border, until now. What the North Vietnamese didn't know was that the Americans had been preparing something completely different. Something that would make distance meaningless. Something that would turn the enemy's greatest advantage into their greatest weakness. The NVA thought they had time. They thought they understood American capabilities. They thought they knew what was coming. They were catastrophically wrong. The secret. Yi was sitting in plain sight at dozens of American bases across South Vietnam. The 1st Cavalry Division, the Airmobile, 17,000 troops, 434 helicopters. Not a mechanized column that had to grind through jungle roads. Not infantry that had to walk mile after mile through ambush country. A flying army that could leap over the terrain itself. Traditional American doctrine said, you advance slowly. You secure the roads. You build bridges across rivers. You bring up artillery. You establish supply lines. Tank columns push forward at 2 or 3 miles per hour with infantry protecting the flanks. Engineers clear mines and fix bridges. The whole massive machine crawls forward like a steel caterpillar. For 80 miles of jungle, that meant 5 to 7 days minimum. The North Vietnamese had built their entire defensive strategy around that timeline. They'd done the math. They knew they had nearly a week to evacuate before American forces could arrive. Air assault doctrine threw all of that away. You didn't need roads. You didn't need bridges. You didn't need vulnerable supply columns stretching for miles. You just picked your target on the map, calculated how much fuel the helicopters needed, and launched the swarm. Distance stopped mattering. A target 80 miles away was the same as a target 8 miles away. The only limit was how much fuel the helicopters could carry. But this wasn't just about having more helicopters. The 1st Cavalry Division had been using helicopters since 1965. What made this different was reconceiving how an entire division could move at once. Not a company of soldiers, not a battalion, an entire division, 10,000 troops, all of them flying, all of them landing on target at nearly the same time. It had never been done before at this scale. The man in charge was Brigadier General Robert Shoemaker. The operation was named Task Force Shoemaker after him. He commanded the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment on the ground and coordinated. With 3 brigades of the 1st Cavalry Division in the air, the ground forces would provide artillery support and secure landing zones. The air assault brigades would do the impossible part. They would fly directly to targets 80 miles away and land on top of the enemy before the enemy even knew they were coming. The preparation happened in complete secrecy. Helicopter crews ran practice missions at night in areas of South Vietnam that looked like Cambodian terrain. They practiced landing in the tight formations. They practiced what to do if helicopters got shot down. They practiced evacuating wounded soldiers while under fire. Fuel bladders were moved to forward positions without anyone explaining why. Artillery officers calculated firing tables for coordinates inside Cambodia, even though those coordinates were officially forbidden until 24 hours before the operation. Infantry companies practiced fighting from what they called cold landing zones. That meant landing in areas that weren't secure, landing right on top of enemy positions, hitting the ground fighting. The whole philosophy was different. Speed became the weapon, not overwhelming firepower, not superior armor, just overwhelming tempo. Hit the enemy before they realize they were being hit. Move so fast that distance doesn't protect them anymore. The North Vietnamese thought their sanctuaries were safe because they were 80 miles away from American bases. What they didn't understand was that 80 miles of jungle meant nothing to helicopters. Their greatest advantage was about to become their greatest weakness. They'd concentrated their forces in Cambodia. They'd built massive supply dumps. They'd established command posts and hospitals and training camps. They'd put everything in one place because they thought it was safe. They were about to learn what happens when safe stops being safe. The contrast was total. Old doctrine said, advance carefully, secure your flanks, maintain supply lines, consolidate gains. New doctrine said, forget all that. Jump directly to the objective, land in chaos, win through speed and shock. Old doctrine took a week to move 80 miles. New doctrine took hours. April 30th, 1970. 7:30 hours, 7:30 in the morning. B-52 bombers struck suspected North Vietnamese positions inside Cambodia. The bombing runs were massive. The ground shook for miles. Huge explosions threw dirt and trees hundreds of feet into the air. This was standard procedure. The North Vietnamese had seen it 1,000 times. American operations always started with B-52 strikes. You just hunkered down in your bunker, waited for the bombs to stop falling, then came back out and resumed operations. The NVA soldiers in Base Area 353 did exactly that. They took cover. They waited. The bombs stopped. They started coming out of their bunkers. Then, at 0800 hours, 8 o'clock in the morning, the sky turned black with helicopters. Not 10 helicopters. Not 20. Hundreds. 3 entire brigades launching. Simultaneously, over 10,000 troops in the air at once. UH-1 Huey helicopters flying in formations of 10 to 20 aircraft. They stacked at different altitudes so the rotor wash from one helicopter wouldn't affect the others. The sound was beyond description. Each helicopter rotor made a distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop sound. Multiply that by hundreds of helicopters and individual sounds disappeared into one continuous roar. It was like standing next to a waterfall made of machines. The sound was a physical force. You felt it in your chest. Your teeth vibrated. The air itself seemed to shake. Vietnamese farmers 80 miles away looked up and saw the horizon darken. They'd seen helicopters before. Everyone in Vietnam had seen helicopters, but nobody had ever seen anything like this. The sky was full of them, stretching from horizon to horizon. A mechanical storm heading west, heading toward Cambodia. Inside the helicopters, soldiers sat on canvas seats with their rifles between their knees. The crew chiefs stood in the open doors with M60 machine guns mounted on posts. The wind roared through the open doors. The turbine engines screamed. You couldn't hear anything else. You couldn't talk to the soldier next to you. You just sat there feeling the vibration through the metal floor and watched the jungle pass underneath at 120 miles per hour. The North Vietnamese in Base Area 353 heard the sound before they saw anything. That rotor noise carried for miles. At first they thought it was a normal helicopter assault, maybe a company or two, maybe 100 or 200 soldiers. They'd fought off assaults like that before. Then the first helicopters appeared over the tree line, then more, then more. The sky filled with them. Soldiers on the ground stopped and stared. Their defensive positions faced south because that's where ground columns would come from. Their artillery pointed south. Their trenches faced south. Nobody was looking up because nobody expected an attack from the sky. Not at this scale. Not this far from American bases. The first wave of Hueys dropped toward landing zone east at 0930 hours, 9:30 in the morning. 80 miles from where they'd started. The door gunners opened fire before the skids touched dirt. They were landing in the enemy's kitchen. The Hueys came in fast and steep, noses pulled up high, tail rotors almost touching the jungle canopy. Door gunners leaned into their M60 machine guns and opened fire, 2,000 rounds per minute per gun. Red tracer rounds laced into the tree lines like deadly ribbons of light. The sound was a constant roar, a ripping noise that drowned out everything else. Pilots held the helicopters in hover for exactly 3 seconds. Troops jumped from 4 feet up, hit the ground running, weapons ready. Then the pilots pulled pitch and climbed away fast, making room for the next wave coming in right behind them. Base Area 353 was called the City by American intelligence. It was the main logistics hub for the entire North Vietnamese war effort in the south. Acres of warehouses, supply dumps, repair facilities, barracks that could house thousands of soldiers. The North Vietnamese had built all of this because they thought it was safe, 80 miles inside Cambodia, protected by distance and political boundaries. They'd spent 5 years building these facilities, 5 years stocking them with ammunition, food, weapons, medical supplies, everything an army needed to keep fighting. Now, Americans were landing right in the middle of it. The North Vietnamese weren't ready. They had prepared defensive positions along the roads and trails leading from South Vietnam. Their artillery pieces pointed south toward where ground columns would approach. Their trenches faced south. Their machine gun nests covered southern approaches. Some positions were 20 miles to the south. That's where they expected to fight. That's where they'd planned to delay American forces for days while the sanctuaries were evacuated. Instead, helicopters were landing behind all those defenses, landing in areas that were supposed to be completely secure, landing next to supply warehouses, landing between barracks buildings, landing everywhere. The contact was immediate. AK-47 fire cracked from the tree line. The distinctive popping sound of Kalashnikov rifles, sharper than American M16s. North Vietnamese soldiers ran from buildings shooting on full automatic. RPGs whooshed out of concealed positions. Rocket-propelled grenades with warheads that could blow a helicopter out of the sky. One RPG hit a Huey in the tail rotor. The helicopter spun violently like a top. The pilot fought the controls, but physics won. The Huey pancaked into the red dirt of the landing zone. The main rotor blades hit the ground and disintegrated into flying pieces of metal. The crew scrambled out through the dust and smoke while the helicopter slid sideways across the ground. Pilots in the following wave saw the crash and adjusted their approach angles to avoid the wreckage. They kept coming. The assault never stopped, but the sheer volume of American forces overwhelmed any organized enemy response. 10 helicopters landing every minute. Each helicopter carried 10 soldiers. That meant 50 troops on the ground every minute. 500 troops in 10 minutes. 1,000 troops in 20 minutes. The North Vietnamese soldiers tried to fight. They fired from windows and doorways. They threw grenades. Some stood their ground and emptied entire magazines at the incoming helicopters. But for every American helicopter they shot at, 10 more appeared. Then 20 more. Then 50 more. The sky stayed black with them. The rotor noise never stopped. It was like trying to fight a thunderstorm. Some NVA soldiers tried to organize a defense. Squad leaders shouted orders that nobody could hear over the helicopter noise. Some tried to retreat in good order, carrying wounded comrades and equipment, but most just ran. They dropped their weapons and ran into the jungle. This wasn't a battle they could win. This wasn't a battle they could even understand. American forces weren't supposed to be here, not this fast, not in these numbers, not landing from the sky. Everything they'd been taught about American tactics was wrong. The 2nd Brigade hit Landing Zone North at 10:15 hours, 10:15 in the morning, base area 352. This was Quoc Vien's administrative headquarters, the brain of the entire enemy war effort. Bunkers built with layers of logs and dirt that could survive direct artillery hits. Communication centers with radio equipment, training facilities, supply warehouses organized by type, small arms ammunition in one area, mortar rounds in another, medical supplies in a third, rice storage buildings that held thousands of tons. This was where the North Vietnamese planned the entire war in South Vietnam. The enemy had received warning that something was happening. Radio reports from Base Area 353 were fragmentary and panicked, Americans landing everywhere, helicopters by the hundreds, positions being overrun. The officers at COSVN didn't have time to evacuate properly. They started emergency demolition procedures. Soldiers ran through buildings, throwing thermite grenades into file cabinets. White-hot flames erupted as classified documents caught fire. Engineers set explosive charges in ammunition dumps. The first charges went off just as American helicopters appeared overhead. Massive secondary explosions threw debris hundreds of feet into the air. Black smoke boiled up in thick columns that could be seen for miles. Smaller explosions popped off continuously as ammunition cooked off in the fires. It sounded like a giant string of firecrackers that never ended. But the North Vietnamese didn't have enough time to destroy everything. American troops landed and immediately started clearing bunkers. They found maps still tacked to walls showing every Viet Cong cell in South Vietnam. Roster lists with thousands of names, supply manifests detailing everything that had moved down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for the past 6 months, radio codebooks, after-action reports from previous battles, personnel files. The intelligence officers who arrived on later helicopters couldn't believe what they were finding. Documents were still smoldering and burning headquarters buildings. Soldiers would kick through smoking debris and find filing cabinets full of papers. Some documents were partially burned but still readable. This was the complete picture of enemy operations, everything they had wanted to know for 5 years. And the North Vietnamese had to leave it all behind because they ran out of time. The 3rd Brigade hit Landing Zone West at 11:45 hours. 11:45 in the morning, this was the deepest penetration. Hospital complexes with surgical facilities, prisoner of war camps. The buildings were spread through thick jungle connected by paths. American troops landing in these areas found things that made them furious. Bamboo cages barely big enough for a man to sit in. American prisoners who'd been held for months or years. Some prisoners were so sick they couldn't stand. Some had infected wounds. Some had been tortured. One prisoner captured in 1968 didn't believe the rescue was real. He thought he was hallucinating. He'd been alone so long, he'd lost track of what year it was. Medics ran toward the prisoners while gunships circled overhead, suppressing any enemy resistance. Door gunners on the gunships fired into any position that showed movement. Miniguns spinning so fast, they sounded like buzzsaws. 6,000 rounds per minute. The tracers looked like solid beams of red light, connecting the helicopters to the ground. The jungle exploded wherever the tracers touched. Trees fell, vegetation disintegrated. Any North Vietnamese soldier caught in the open disappeared. By 1700 hours, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, all 3 brigades had secured their objectives, 80 miles from their starting positions. The North Vietnamese sanctuaries that had been untouchable for 5 years had been overrun in less than 10 hours. Soldiers who'd eaten breakfast at fire bases in South Vietnam were now standing in enemy base camps deep inside Cambodia. The distances that were supposed to protect the North Vietnamese meant nothing. The week of warning time, they thought they had never existed. The careful defensive positions they'd prepared were bypassed completely. Everything they believed about American capabilities was wrong. Captured enemy documents translated after the battle told the story from their perspective. One North Vietnamese after-action report said the helicopter soldiers appeared without warning in secure areas. There were no defensive preparations. Command and control collapsed immediately. Units scattered without orders. Many soldiers abandoned weapons and supplies. The speed of the American advance exceeded all understanding. They were reported at the border. 1 hour later, they occupied positions we believed would take 3 days to reach. Another document was even simpler. An intelligence officer's note that just said, "Good God, they're already there." 5 words that captured the complete shock of commanders who thought they understood the battlefield and discovered they understood nothing. The Cambodian incursion lasted 60 days. The 1st Cavalry Division's air assault, that impossible 80-mile leap that happened in just hours instead of days, became the model every other American unit tried to copy. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment followed up with ground columns. The 25th Infantry Division launched their own air assaults into different base areas. South Vietnamese airborne units joined the operation. For 2 months, American and South Vietnamese forces systematically tore apart sanctuaries that had been safe since 1965. Base camps were destroyed. Supply dumps were captured or burned. Ammunition, stockpiles that took years to build, disappeared in massive explosions. Weapons caches were seized. Documents were collected by the truckload. The numbers told a brutal story. The North Vietnamese lost an estimated 11,349 soldiers killed. American and South Vietnamese losses were 976 dead. That's a kill ratio of nearly 12-1. But the real damage wasn't measured in bodies. It was measured in what the enemy lost permanently. 1,786 individual weapons captured, everything from AK-47 rifles to heavy machine guns. 2,000 tons of ammunition seized. That's 4 million pounds of bullets, rockets, mortar rounds, and artillery shells. 14 million rounds of small arms ammunition. 143,000 mortar and rocket rounds. 199,000 anti-aircraft rounds. 5,500 mines. 55,000 pounds of explosives. 1.5 million pages of documents that told American intelligence everything about enemy operations, plans, and organization. More importantly, the North Vietnamese lost their staging areas. For the next year, cross-border attacks into South Vietnam dropped by 60%. The enemy simply couldn't launch operations at the same scale anymore. Their supplies were gone. Their base camps were destroyed. Their command structure was disrupted. The massive Easter offensive that the North Vietnamese had planned for 1971 had to be delayed until 1972. And when it finally came, it lacked the supply depth it would have had if the Cambodian sanctuaries had stayed intact. Intelligence officers estimated that the Cambodian incursion set back North Vietnamese operations by at least 18 months. General Shoemaker received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. The 1st Cavalry Division cemented its reputation as the most innovative unit in Vietnam. Air assault doctrine that had been tested in the Ia Drang Valley back in 1965 and refined through 5 years of jungle combat had just achieved its masterpiece. Military planners studied the operation for years afterward. The idea that you could move an entire division 80 miles in hours and land them directly on enemy positions changed how the Army thought about mobility and speed. The 1st Cav had proven that distance could be made irrelevant if you had enough helicopters and the courage to use them aggressively. But here's where the story turns bitter. Here's where tactical brilliance crashes into strategic failure. They won the battle. They disrupted the enemy. They proved that air assault doctrine could project power in ways conventional forces couldn't match. And none of it mattered in the end. The Cambodian incursion triggered massive protests back home in America. College campuses erupted. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard soldiers fired into a crowd of student protesters. 4 students died. 9 others were wounded. The photographs went around the world. A young woman, kneeling next to a dead student, her face frozen in a scream. The protests spread to hundreds of campuses. Students went on strike. Some universities shut down completely. The American public turned decisively against the war. The Senate repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the legal foundation for American military involvement in Vietnam. Congress set a firm deadline for American withdrawal. President Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, handing the war over to South Vietnamese forces, accelerated dramatically. By 1972, most American combat units were gone. By 1973, all American ground forces had withdrawn. The North Vietnamese didn't panic. They'd been fighting for 20 years. They could fight for 20 more if necessary. They simply waited. They rebuilt the sanctuaries in Cambodia. It took time, but they had time. They resumed operations. They rebuilt supply routes. They trained new units to replace the ones destroyed. They launched the Easter Offensive in 1972. They absorbed the losses from that offensive and kept planning. They launched their final offensive in 1975. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975, exactly 5 years after the Cambodian incursion began. North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The war was over. The communists had won. All those captured weapons meant nothing in the end. All those destroyed base camps meant nothing. All that brilliant tactical innovation meant nothing. The 1st Cavalry Division had executed the most successful air assault operation in military history. They'd moved faster and struck harder than anyone thought possible. They'd terrified the North Vietnamese command. And 20 years later, Vietnam was one country under communist control, exactly as Ho Chi Minh had wanted from the beginning. But the lessons from those 48 hours didn't disappear. They became doctrine. They influenced every American military operation that came after. When Task Force Ranger launched raids in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1993, they used air assault techniques refined in Cambodia. When American forces executed Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan in 2002, landing troops directly on enemy positions in mountain valleys, they were using the same concepts the 1st Cav pioneered. The entire idea of vertical envelopment, of bypassing terrain and obstacles to strike deep into enemy territory, traces directly back to those hours when American soldiers moved 80 miles faster than anyone believed possible. Modern Army doctrine about speed and tempo and striking before the enemy can react all comes from the Cambodian incursion. But Vietnam teaches a harder lesson that military commanders still struggle with today. Tactical brilliance can't overcome strategic bankruptcy. You can be the best soldiers in the world. You can have the best equipment. You can win every battle. You can move 80 miles in 48 hours. You can capture thousands of weapons and destroy enemy sanctuaries and kill the enemy at ratios of 12 to 1. And you can still lose the war if the strategy is fundamentally flawed, if the political will doesn't exist, if the American public won't support the mission, if the government you're defending can't or won't defend itself. The jungle reclaimed Base Area 353 within months of American forces leaving. Vegetation grows fast in Cambodia. Within a year, you couldn't tell there had been a massive battle there. Within 5 years, the bunkers had collapsed. The craters from bombs filled with water and vegetation. The shell casings rusted and disappeared into the soil. Today it's farmland. Rice paddies, small villages. Occasionally a farmer's plow turns up a rusted M16 receiver or an unexploded cluster bomb. Bomb disposal teams still work in Cambodia, removing ordnance left over from the war. But mostly the jungle took it all back. The trees grew, the scars healed, the silence returned. But somewhere in Hanoi's military archives, there's still a report stamped March 1970. An intelligence officer wrote 5 words that captured the moment when the untouchable became touchable, when sanctuaries became battlefields, when distance stopped protecting them. Good God, they're already there. 5 words written by a man who suddenly understood that everything he believed about American limitations was catastrophically wrong. For 48 hours, those words meant something. For 48 hours, the North Vietnamese were afraid. For 48 hours, it seemed like tactical genius might actually change the course of the war. And then politics, strategy, and time proved that wars aren't won by brilliant operations alone. They're won by whoever can endure the longest. And in Vietnam, that was never going to be America. The helicopters flew, the soldiers fought, the enemy scattered, the sanctuaries fell. And 5 years later, it all meant nothing. That's the tragedy of the Cambodian incursion. Not that it failed tactically, it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The tragedy is that success wasn't enough.